the next half an hour or so, we have a talk from James Thomas, who's a data science specialist at the Jean Golding Institute in Bristol. And so you've already seen loads from James answering your various questions on Slack and in communications before this event. So I'm sure you'll know he's been absolutely invaluable in getting the event together and helped kind of help us, people like me and Dan, in getting to grips with how to run an event like this. So I'll hand over to you, James.
Thanks, Will. Can everyone see my, you can all hear me and see my screen, hopefully, before I start. Great. Well, when I was asked to just speak for up to half an hour, I was given the title top tips from a data specialist. And the other part of the brief was try to share some best practice with people, but don't really use any code because that'll be too boring. So I've tried to do that. So I've tried to sort of use an analogy that many of you will have come across before. So instead of calling it top tips from a data specialist, I've called it thinking in spreadsheets. .xlsx. So a little bit easier than the data structures that you're working with today, but hopefully easier to talk about because they're sort of fundamentally a little bit more basic. If we've got time at the end, I would be really interested to hear what techniques people use. I'm going to go through some sort of ones that I've used and I've come across in the past, and be really interested to get people's input, and mainly because it's you that work in this field. You're the experts here. So yeah, what do you use? Are there things that you try and do but you can't do because it's too difficult or it doesn't work very well for you? I'd be really interested to hear that as well. And if there's some other tools that you use that I don't mention, then I would quite like to sort of compile a list of useful tools as well. So maybe we could continue the conversation in Slack, for the rest of the day. If you've got any suggestions, and I'll sort of add them to the resources here that we send out. So here's an example of a spreadsheet that I used to work with. So I came from an industry company. So I used to work in an engineering company, mainly with chemical engineers, and across the company, this sort of spreadsheet would be very common. So you'd have some sort of raw data. There would have been some kind of calculations would have been done, and you'd have some kind of visualization or calculation that would be done on it. And why have I chosen to talk about spreadsheets? Because I think it's possibly a bit odd for a talk like this. Well, they are actually quite clever, quite good. I mean, you can store data in them, but they also store all of the logic that you're doing for the processing of that data. Well, sort of. They don't store why you're doing what you're doing, but they do store the steps that you're applying. They store the results to those calculations and they cache the results to those calculations. There's a built-in visualization tool, even though it's fairly rudimentary. But all of these things get updated automatically. So if you change some of the data, then all the visualizations and all the results are automatically updated. So if you open the spreadsheet with the data in it, the results will generally be correct. It's mostly forwards compatible as well. So if you open it in a newer version of Excel, usually you can always see the data and the results that you've produced in an earlier version of Excel. And as I say, I'm talking about them here just because it's generally a little bit easier to understand than some of these complex data structures that you're using on Jasmine for your analysis. So just to give an example, I might start up Excel on my computer. So it would probably look something like that on Windows 10. But there's a bit of a problem here immediately with spreadsheets because, well, you might be on a Mac, so it might look slightly different. The functionality may be slightly different. Some people might not have either of those, especially if you're using Linux. So maybe you're using the web-based version that people often use. If you're unlucky, then you might have an older version of Excel installed. And if you're using a lab computer, if you're doing some experimental work, then you might have a very old version of Excel installed. Some people don't have Excel at all, so they've got LibreOffice or some other alternative like that. So what's the analogy here? What am I getting at? Well, this problem isn't unique to spreadsheets and Office programs. It's it sort of heavily impacts the use of code and the ability to reproduce results. And there's almost two kinds of problems that you can get. You can get code that you try and run on a different system and it doesn't work, which is kind of that's better than the second problem, which is it does work. Well, it fails, but in a way that you don't notice. So it gives you a result that's incorrect, and you haven't, and it's not obvious that it's done that. So it doesn't actually tell you that it's failed, just something silently goes wrong. And the version of the programming language you're using makes a difference, and also all the packages that you're using. So we've got lots of packages that we're using over the hackathon over these 3 days. They all make a difference. And the key thing really is, what if you share your code with someone else? And I put a little asterisk next to someone else here, because that someone else could also be you in the future. We've got an example from the hackathon where people have been sharing code, and almost you would have thought that it should have worked on one person's Jupyter notebook and another person's Jupyter notebook, because they hadn't really changed anything. But it didn't, and that it turned out we managed to debug it in the end, and it turned out it was because some of the package versions were different and had been overridden, just because of the way that the Jupyter notebook system works. So throughout this presentation, I'm just going to kind of allude to some of the tools that I've come across and I use in order to kind of help alleviate these problems. There are Python virtual environments, or VNs is the newer version of the package. That's the kind of the built-in virtual environments that you get. There's Conda environments, and that's actually what, if you've activated the environment in your notebook or at the command line that we gave you in one of the help files, that's what we're using, and that's actually what Jasmine used as well. If you use R, then there's a really good package called renv as well. And what these sort of boil down to is you end up with a list of packages that you've used, and they generally save the exact versions of all of those packages. And that means that theoretically you can give that list of packages to someone else or yourself in the future. Maybe you've got a different machine, and you should be able to regenerate the output successfully. Sometimes you can, if it doesn't work, I mean, during the creation of the hackathon, when we were writing the guides, I got a colleague to test it, and it didn't work for them. And that was because in the 5 days between me sending them the example to try and them running it, the version of the package had been upgraded, and something very slightly had changed with the syntax, and it had stopped working. So in our example, because we'd seen that happen, it only took us about 2 hours to find the problem, whereas I've spent days before in my previous roles trying to find out what the problem is. So this is, I'd say, one takeaway would be try and use these environments as much as possible. Now, another problem that you used to encounter with Excel, but less so, is that people sometimes didn't have Excel at all, and they didn't have the ability to install it. So there was a really old thing called Microsoft Excel Viewer that you had, which would kind of let you view spreadsheets. And I'm aware that in the outputs that we're producing during the hackathon, it's a similar kind of problem that we might encounter, because we're creating potentially Jupyter notebooks that have code and visualization in, and we might want to give them to someone that isn't able to run, doesn't have that environment set up, or just doesn't know how, they don't have the expertise to do that. So there are a few one-click options that you might have heard of that will help you with this. So there's a tool called NB Viewer. It's an NB Viewer Jupyter website, which will enable you to view notebooks. You won't be able to run calculations within them, but it will render the notebook as if you were running it, so that you can at least see all of the text, all of the code, all of the outputs. And then if you check your notebook into GitHub, then it will automatically run it through this notebook viewer. So that's really handy. There's another really amazing tool called Binder, which takes a little bit more setup to get running, but with a one-click option, that will actually give people a sort of little virtual PC or virtual server on the internet when they click it, and they will be able to interact with the notebook and actually rerun the code. So that's really powerful if you publish a paper and then you have this sort of a Binder link in a GitHub repository, say for the paper, and it will actually allow somebody to reproduce your results actually in their browser almost immediately, and then make tweaks if they want to. All of that, of course, relies on all of the virtual environments and other things that I've talked about already. Okay, so what about other software, so maybe it's not Python, maybe it's not R, maybe there's some other sort of specific tool that you might need, then there's an option called Docker, which is a sort of containerized environment. There's reproducible environment, so you get a sort of a file called a Docker file, a bit of an example on the right here, and they sort of very closely specify what needs to be done to that environment to create that environment. So you might start with a specific version of Python, you might install a specific version of a tool, and then you might install some requirements from, of say Python libraries or something like that. And that they can also, this sort of technique can also be useful. We're kind of ramping up the, is it a bit more difficult to set up this this kind of environment. This kind of technique here is actually how the binder service works. And then kind of even more complicated on top of that is you can actually run whole virtual machines for data processing. So say you've got a very specific piece of software that you need to use and have installed, you can actually have a whole virtual environment, virtual computer running somewhere, maybe in the cloud, that people can use to run and generate your results. So I'm just going to take a step back and let's kind of have a look at one of the example spreadsheets that you might be dealing with. So I've got a spreadsheet here of time, wind speed, wind direction, temperature, with some of the typical things that you see in spreadsheets when people save spreadsheets of data. So at the top, we've got the units for things like wind speed, but they're not very well defined. So people have added comments within Excel. I see this a lot that specify things in a bit more detail. We've got some invalid data in the left column. So someone's just highlighted that in red. So if you open the spreadsheet, it's really obvious to you as a human that's a problem. In the middle, might be hard to see in the wind direction column, we've got some data that was obviously missing at some point. It's been interpolated. So again, someone's put a handy comment in there on those cells so that we know that that's been interpolated. There's a dodgy looking value a bit further down. So we've got yellow highlighting, and then we've actually got some missing data on the right-hand side. The issue here, though, is if you access this data with a formula in Excel, you won't see any of this formatting. So you won't know that the data is invalid. If you load the spreadsheet into a tool like Python or R to do some processing, then of course you wouldn't see any of this formatting. So we generally discourage people from sort of highlighting invalid data. But again, what's the analogy here in the code when we write code? Well, the sort of two things that I took away from it are trying to have tidy data and actually keeping good metadata for your data. So by tidy data, I don't just mean keeping it neat and tidy. I also mean organizing the data in such a way that it's easy for the machine to read. So normally you keep variables in their own columns, observations in their own rows, and then each cell is a value. Now, if you're using a tool like Xarray or Iris to access the data on CMIP6, this is actually effectively all done for you, and they kind of abstract this away from you. So they are already storing the data in a particular way, but the way you access data and you say, I want this column of data, I want to select these rows of data, does this for you. So we've almost got a bit of a tick here already. But one of the biggest problems I have with CMIP6 data when I was finding out about it is I really didn't understand what any of the variables meant and what any of the data was, what units anything was in. And one of the key things, especially if you're working with other people's data, that doesn't mean you can't write a document that describes it. So there's a really good link at the bottom that sort of suggests what you should include. But what's the variable name? What's the more descriptive name of the variable? Is there a better explanation of the variable? How is that data actually collected? What units is it in? What's the kind of allowable range for that value to fall within, which helps you when you're doing tests to see whether there's a problem with the data. And then if you do find problems with the data, then don't alter data in your raw data. Never change the raw data files. Now, luckily, again, with the way we're working on Jasmine, the way it's set up, you can't change the data because it's read-only. So that's really good in the sense that it prevents you from doing that. So if you do need to make and actually save sort of slightly modified data, then always save that as an intermediate data file. And if you have any sort of workarounds, so say for example that the data in a particular time range is invalid, then it's best generally not to just hard code that in some code. It's better to use some kind of indicator. So maybe another column that indicates whether the data is valid, or a technique I've used in the past is to have a whole new file that will actually list the ranges of data that are invalid. So for any kind of data collection exercise, I find that really useful doing it that way, because if someone says, can you generate me a report on when our sensors were down, say, I've already got that because it's exactly the same kind of data validity file that I've created. Right, so I'm going to move back now to another example that I've seen regularly in my old job. We might start with a data file that someone creates, and perhaps we collect some data for the sort of an ongoing project, and that data file fills up, and then maybe we get an extension to our funding. But because we've already generated and maybe written a paper, we've sort of published on that first phase of the project, maybe we put our second lot of data into data phase 2. And don't forget, these files contain all of the processing as well. So it's not just the data, it's also all of the formulae, all of the logic, all of the data visualization. And of course, then someone comes along and says, well, it would be really good if we could have those together. So you end up having data underscore combined. That's a fairly common thing that I used to see. Sometimes these are nested in folders as well, so it's even more difficult to see what's going on. But of course, you've got some other data that you need to combine that with that comes along. So maybe some third-party data that's generally stored somewhere else. So quite often I used to see data combined, just to sort of make you very aware that was the actual full data set that was combined. The trouble is, maybe other data now gets revised because the person that sent you the data actually made a few mistakes. So very quickly we get up to sort of files that are along the lines of data combined, revised, v2 final, or sometimes final v2 revised, because it wasn't actually final. And maybe the date gets saved in and the initials of the person that's checked the file. And of course, this isn't necessarily a spreadsheet. These things all apply to code as well. It's exactly the same problem, and it becomes incredibly difficult to keep track of, especially if multiple people are working on it in a hackathon like this. So what do we do to keep track? Well, what many of you have been using over the hackathon and others have been learning about is version control, and we've sort of nudged people towards using Git. There are other things that you could use. Git is really the most common one that people use. And it removes the need to have all these multiple copies. It stores all the copies of the code, but it stores them with dates and messages and authors to say what changed. And it's very clever at working out what's changed between the files. So if you end up with a large volume of code in a file, there's some really useful commands where it can actually tell you the last person to change this line was this person. So that if you end up with a bug in your program, you can immediately go back and almost find out who to blame for it. In fact, the command is called git blame. You also get a free history of what's happened. I found this really useful in the past because working in the commercial sector, I'm often asked, can you just go back at that work that you did and work out how long it took you? Because we're budgeting for another grant that we're applying for, or another proposal that we're giving to a client, and we'd like to know how long this task took. And I've often gone back through my Git log, my sort of history of my Git, and kind of just looked at the dates and thought, oh, I can see I probably spent about an hour on each of these. And I can just very quickly get a rough idea of how long the project took. And it's usually a lot longer than you think. So that's a very good way of keeping track of code. What about data? So in that previous example where you've got multiple bits of data sort of being added and then regenerated, how do we know if we regenerate some of that initial data, maybe there was a mistake in it, how do we know which data files we have to regenerate? And that's when tools for pipelines come in really handy. So there's one if you use Mac or Linux called Make, which just you'll have on your system already. That's really useful for making pipelines. You can install that through various means on Windows as well, but there are also many other tools that you can use that get a lot more complicated. And these isolate the work that you're doing into independent steps, but it's very clever about it. So if, for example, the raw data changes, it will know that it needs to rerun the following steps, and it will work out which steps need to be reapplied. If you change the way your gridding program works, then it will know that it doesn't need to get the raw data again or mask the invalid data. It just needs to rerun the analysis. So they're very clever in the way that they work. And when you start having even a sort of fairly moderately sized project, doesn't need to be that big, these tools are very, very useful. So keeping up the pace. We try and save our Excel spreadsheet now, but we get this kind of error message in saving that it's in use by somebody else has got it open, or even if you use tools like SharePoint, you get, okay, we can't upload this file because another user's made changes with it, they conflict. So how do you work with others? I mean, you can't, it's very difficult in a hackathon like this, you're working so quickly, you don't want to open other people's documents and you make changes as they're trying to make changes to them. So we try and make use of collaborative tools, many of which are free, or if they're not free generally, then they have free use for academic plans. So you can apply fairly quickly, get quite a high level of access. And they have, as well as this kind of collaborative Git repository, they also have many other sort of collaborative tools like issues you can create. You can assign people to issues to work on. So they're really good for to-do lists, working separately on different branches. You can automate things to happen when people update the code. I'll talk about that in a second. And other really good project management tools as well. So, okay, so we're back in our spreadsheet now. And in Excel, you may know if you double click on a formula, something like this, it kind of goes away and it tries to highlight what all the cells are and sort of helps you trace through what the formula does. Now, if I was in a spreadsheet like this and I clicked on a cell, you can kind of work out, well, this is, I don't know, it's sort of finding the maximum of two things. And one of the two things is a formula and the other thing is a single number. And then some of them are locked. They kind of got dollars. It all gets very confusing. There is a feature in Excel when you can name cells and you can name ranges. So you could change that formula to something like this, and it would probably make more sense. Apparently, you can also put new lines in formulae in Excel if they get really long, makes them easier to understand. And not a lot of people know that, but it's just quite fun to do sometimes. And what we're not capturing here, though, is what's the intent of what we're trying to do. So what you would do preferably in a spreadsheet is you might actually create your own function. Gets a little bit tricky, but then it would then actually be really obvious what it is you're doing in this cell. So the analog to code is helping the reader and the reader of the code as they come back to it. And again, just to emphasize, that's the reader of the code is probably you in 6 months' time when you've forgotten what it does. So some common techniques, things like using informative variable names. So I've got some examples here. They're all the same thing, and they're sort of common abbreviations that people use. But I think you will agree that the meaning of what the number is changes dramatically over what the variable name could possibly suggest it is. The other thing that you can do is try and use functions as much as possible in your code to encapsulate the actual nuts and bolts of the work that you're doing inside a function. So yes, when you're prototyping and you're writing your Jupyter notebook, you end up writing lots and lots of code, but then actually you need to come back and refactor that and try and say, well, what is it that I'm actually doing here? And one of the best things to end up with is like a mini sort of pipeline in your code. So I've got I did put in a bit of code. Here is an example of something that you could do if you were doing some analysis in pandas. And there's no nuts and bolts there. You can't see what it's doing, but you can understand what it's doing. And the equivalent code, if you wrote it out, might be sort of 30 or 40 lines long. And I bet it's a lot quicker for you to read that and understand what's going on rather than read the 30 or 40 lines of code behind that. So we've gone and saved our document. We've given it to somebody else, and now they've made some changes, and we're going to open the changes that they've made. But okay, they've obviously messed something up when they've been editing the document. So the final thing that I want to talk about, which is very important and will help with reproducibility, is verifying the outputs. Now, this is something that goes on a lot in the software engineering world. And when you enter the kind of the data science and academic world, this is kind of much newer to people. But there are lots of frameworks that I'm just going to kind of mention the names of here. So there's one called unit test and there's one called PyTest. And what the purpose of these is when you make changes to your code, they contain lots of checks that will be run automatically. So you might run sense checks kind of when you change your code. So you say, well, I'm just going to run it and see if that graph looks okay. Check that there aren't lots of minus numbers and things in it like that. And what in essence you do with these tools is you encode all of those checks in a few lines of code. And then every time anyone makes any changes to your project, you rerun all of these tests. So you could do something like you could perform a calculation with some known data, and you know that the answer should be some number or some grid of numbers. Well, you could save that as this is my test data. And then anytime anyone changes your file, you could say, well, we should get roughly the same answer. And then the final thing is that you can automate those things as well. So there's some other really cool tools with GitHub called GitHub Actions. There's Travis continuous integration, and you use these tools in a much larger project to actually automate these tests. So rather than you having to kind of remember to run the tests anytime anyone commits or pushes something to your GitHub repository, all of these checks and balances are automatically applied. So I'll just end by giving you some just sort of two really useful resources. I think the most useful resources that I found so far. The first one is the Turing Way, which is a sort of collaborative book project from the Alan Turing Institute in London for data science. And there's also a European Centre for Mid-Range Weather Forecasting workshop on building reproducible workflows for earth sciences, which has got lots and lots of presentations and recordings in, which is really useful. So thanks very much.